Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're tackling something that's, well, it's more than just policy.
It really is. It's a high-stakes intellectual argument. It's about the very soul of a global power.
Exactly. We are diving deep into the case for American power, which, at this particular moment in history is a fiercely debated premise.
And that's putting it mildly, especially when you think about who's losing faith in the American project right now. Young activists, people deeply critical of foreign policy.
A lot of our listeners probably.
I would think so. And that tension is really the core of what we're looking at today.
The source material we're drawing from is centered on a discussion with Shadi Hamid, who's defending his book, The Case for American Power.
And what's so fascinating here, what makes it so compelling, is the conflict inside the argument itself. I mean, here's an author who has built his career critiquing U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
And yet he's written something that's described as a love letter to America despite all its flaws.
I mean, that phrase alone, a love letter written at the exact moment the U.S. is, by his own admission, enabling the tragedy in Gaza, that's one heck of an intellectual tightrope to walk.
It is. And our goal today for you is to get a really nuanced handle on this.
We want to dissect why someone would argue for American power, even with all his obvious painful flaws.
And also, how do the sharpest critics challenge that? I mean, the ones who go right down to the nation's DNA and say the whole project is rotten.
And then what's the path forward? What's the practical political advice for citizens who feel, betrayed but still want to find a way to work for justice?
Because the author really believes this moment forces a choice. You can't just be a bystander anymore.
You either lose faith completely,
or you decide to fight harder, believing that those founding ideals are somehow still recoverable.
So we're going to pull apart that choice, look at the history, and really ask, is American power salvageable?
That's a big one.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start at the foundation with the argument that, frankly, is going to be controversial for a lot of people, the link between morality and power.
Indeed. The fundamental argument is laid out with startling clarity. He just says it. Moral requires power to be implemented.
Not that it helps, but that it's required. It's a necessity.
It's a paradigm of necessity. So if you hold moral ideals, human rights, democracy, whatever your concept of justice is, they just stay in your head. They're purely theoretical unless you have the capacity, the actual power to protect them or enforce them.
It's such a practical, almost Machiavellian take on idealism. And what I found fascinating is the parallel the analysis draws. This idea that power is necessary to enforce a moral framework is actually something he says is shared with groups like Islamists.
Yes, and that connection is such a powerful intellectual nugget for us to unpack. The source notes that the conviction is the same. You need power to implement your moral vision.
The only difference is the vision itself.
Right. The specifics of the moral framework might be democracy versus religious law, but the underlying belief in the necessity of power is identical. Both would argue an ideal state can't exist without the means to defend itself and project its values.
But, right away, we hit the big pushback, the skeptical counterpoint.
Of course.
Many people, many philosophers would say power is the thing that corrupts. It's what prevents moral action.
And that's where the author introduces this unspoken concept that's really important here, the nirvana fallacy.
Okay, break that down for us.
It's a logical error. It's when you compare a real, existing, flawed thing, in this case, American power, to an impossible, non-existent, perfect ideal. Like a hypothetical, perfectly benevolent global power that has no self-interest.
So the skeptic is asking, why can't power be perfectly moral? And the author's response is basically, because that doesn't exist, and if you wait for it, you just get chaos.
Exactly. You have to work with the flawed tools that are actually on the table. The question isn't whether power is corrupting, of course it is, but whether it's necessary. And if it is, then whose flawed power is the best bet, or at least the one you can steer the most?
Which brings us right to the second pillar of his whole thesis, the pragmatic argument, the simple reality of the world today.
Yeah, that American power remains, for all intents and purposes, uncontested.
We have to deal with this messy reality because, well, there's no real alternative on the horizon.
And this is where the argument shifts away from pure morality and just looks at, raw geopolitical facts. He looks at the main challenger, China, and finds it lacking.
Militarily, economically.
And crucially, culturally weak.
Let's focus on that cultural point for a second, because that's a huge differentiator.
Yeah.
The source points out that China just doesn't have that same global magnetic pull.
Right. There isn't this universal desire for people to emigrate there. The American project, for all its sins, still holds that promise.
It's his litmus test for true global power.
Mm-hmm. Military and economic might are one thing, but soft power, the power to attract, to inspire, that's the real game. And China's ideology, being so rigid and authoritarian, just can't compete with the universal promise of the U.S., even if that promise is broken half the time.
So the conclusion, which is a really tough pill to swallow if you're disillusioned by, say, Gaza, is that because American power is going to be the deciding factor for decades.
We have to work with it.
Someone has to exert the power, and if it's us, it's us. It's just an acceptance of the structure as it is.
And that acceptance, he argues, forces every citizen into one of two paths. You have to choose how you're going to reckon with this reality.
We should define these two paths really clearly, because they basically represent the whole spectrum of political options available.
So path one, he calls a dead end. That's losing faith entirely.
Just deciding America is structurally broken, it's never going to get better, the whole enterprise is a failure.
Right, and that often leads to a kind of accelerationism, where you almost want the system to collapse faster, thinking something better will rise from the ashes.
Which, historically, doesn't usually happen.
Rarely. Usually something far worse follows a collapse.
Okay, so what's path two? The path of hope.
Path two is the belief that America is capable of renewal, of regeneration, despite its massive faults. It's a call to action based on citizen agency in a flawed democracy.
The idea that we get the policy we deserve.
Exactly. If you're a citizen, you still have the tools, voting, organizing, protesting, to actually shape the direction of that power. And his whole book is an argument for choosing that long, difficult path of engagement.
So the foundation is set.
Yeah.
Engage with U.S. power because it's the only game in town. And it might just be steerable. But to even choose that path, you have to believe the system can be redeemed.
And that right there brings us to the core philosophical fight, the DNA of American power. Is it built on beautiful ideals, or is it built on unforgivable sin?
This is where it gets really deep.
It is. The central challenge in the source is figuring out the true nature of American power and asking, how formable is it really? The skeptical view, which is widespread on the left and in marginalized communities, is that it all starts with original sins.
The extermination of Native Americans, the institution of slavery.
Exactly. And if that's your starting point, the question gets really intense. Is all the high-minded talk about equality and freedom just a cover? A pretext to legitimize a much darker game of domination?
Yeah, if the foundation is rotten, can you ever build a moral house on top of it? The cynic would say that engaging with it is just being complicit.
And that's a powerful argument. What part of this thing can be redeemed if the blueprint itself was violent and exclusionary?
But the author pushes back hard on this. He challenges that cynical view by looking at the unique appeal of the American project, especially through the eyes of an immigrant.
He argues that America is founded on moral ideas and beliefs that are universally appealing. And notice the wording appealing, not always applied.
Right. The appeal isn't the track record. It's the promise, the aspiration.
And this is where it gets really personal and practical. He suggests the beauty of the project is how easy it is to become American. You commit to the ideals, to the project, and you're in. It's a nation built on an idea, not on blood and soil.
Which he contrasts pretty sharply with, say, Europe.
Yeah, the source notes that in France or Germany you can get a passport, but full cultural acceptance is elusive. You might never be seen as truly one of us.
Whereas in America, the rite of passage is just buying into the ideals. He highlights the ability for Muslims, for example, to practice their faith freely without giving up their American identity as something globally unique.
And all those ideals are anchored in the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. He sees them not just as hypocritical historical texts, but as documents that planted the seeds for future progress.
That is the optimistic reading. But the interviewer in the source brings in some heavy political theory to make the counter-argument that the darker DNA isn't just hypocrisy, it's a structural feature.
Yes, this references the work of scholars like Elizabeth Anker and her idea of ugly freedoms.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's a subtle but really powerful idea. The argument is that those universal ideals like freedom and autonomy were never actually intended to be universal. They were tied to a concept of mastery.
Let's pause on that because it's so important.
Hey.
The source reminds us that John Locke, the philosopher of liberty, was writing the Constitution for the slave colony of Barbados at the same time his ideas were influencing the U.S. He used the same template for South Carolina.
Right, which suggests that the very concept of freedom at the foundation was inseparable from exclusion. It was the freedom of the property owner, the freedom of the master to do as he pleased.
So when you combine that idea of freedom as mastery with manifest destiny,
Right.
and the kind of global dominance pushed by figures like Theodore Roosevelt,
the skeptic starts to worry that something truly dark is just embedded in the DNA of American power. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And if that's true, then engagement is a fool's errand because a system is designed to be undressed.
So there are the battle lines. Is America defined by ideals waiting to be fulfilled, or by a foundational sin that just uses ideals as a cover?
And to figure that out, you really have to look at the historical evidence. What's the actual track record?
Which brings us perfectly to the historical balance sheet. What has American power actually done in the world since it became the dominant force?
Well, the author makes a pretty profound claim here. He argues that statistically, the world genuinely improved after World War II, and that this improvement correlates directly with American dominance.
So the core historical justification is that U.S. power, as flawed as it is, created a better, more stable world than what came before or what might have come otherwise.
And the main metric he uses is the decline in violence. He points to a significant drop in battle-related deaths from major wars after the U.S. rose to hegemony.
Especially after the Cold War ended, right? The 1990s are seen as this peak of peace and prosperity.
Exactly. The idea is that unipolar stability, having one superpower, just minimized the kind of great power conflicts that tore the world apart for centuries.
And it wasn't just about peace, it was ideological too.
Right. The source points to the third wave of democratization. The number of democracies in the world went from, 8% after the war, up to a peak of over 50%.
That's a staggering change. And the argument is that this was partly because a powerful America was appealing to many people worldwide. It offered an alternative to Soviet communism.
So, on balance, the argument is that American power produced net global gains. But, to be credible, he has to acknowledge the hypocrisy.
Oh, the massive hypocrisy. The Cold War era.
He's very clear that the U.S. failed miserably to live up to its own ideals during that time.
The source notes this clearly. The U.S. actively supported brutal right-wing dictatorships all over the developing world, Latin America, Asia, Africa.
And he specifically calls out the Middle East as the one region where that destructive policy was the most persistent and damaging.
So we sacrificed principle for stability and anti-communism.
But then the narrative changes. In the 1980s, the source suggests a kind of self-correction began. The U.S. started to align more with its ideals. It put pressure on dictators in the Philippines, Brazil, Chile,
leading to democratic transitions. And this is presented as America making amends for its Cold War sins. It shows the system can course correct.
But now we have to turn to the sharpest critique of this whole historical ledger. The interviewer in the source brings up the idea of lying, damned lies, and statistics.
That's such a powerful point. The critique is that by only counting battlefield deaths, the U.S. has basically externalized the true cost of its power.
Exactly. You've made the hardship and violence invisible to your statistics.
This is where we have to talk about the idea of structural violence.
Yes, this is so crucial. Structural violence is death that isn't caused by a bullet or a bomb, but by policy choices. By a system.
Death from sanctions that block medicine, death from man-made famine. The source explicitly uses Gaza as a current example of this. These deaths don't show up in the statistics for conventional wars, but they are just as real.
Precisely. So if your metrics only count World War II-style battlefield deaths, you are fundamentally undercounting the negative impact of American hegemony. The peace and prosperity numbers are, at best, incomplete.
And this leads right to that nagging problem of selective intervention. The realpolitik dilemma. Why does the U.S. act in some places and not others? It always seems to come down to very self-interested, realpolitik motivations, not consistent ideals.
Why Kosovo but not Rwanda? Why democracy for Brazil but not for Egypt?
And the author's response here is, again, rooted in realism. the nirvana fallacy.
He argues that this is just inevitable. No nation-state can ever perfectly separate its moral principles from its own self-interest. Any alternative, a hypothetical caliphate, a Chinese-led world order, would also act in its own interest and would also commit atrocities.
So if self-interest is always part of the equation, the real question becomes about the percentage split.
Right. Is a policy 20% principle and 80% self-interest? Or can we fight to make it 80% principle and 20% self-interest? That becomes the only realistic way to judge American power. It's a debate about optimization, not purity.
Which frames the whole struggle as trying to steer the least bad option in a better direction, rather than waiting for a perfect one that's never going to show up.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked at this flawed power and its mixed historical record. Now let's pivot to how you actually change it from the inside. The democratic engagement versus dialectical struggle question.
This is where the author's call to action really comes into focus, and his central warning is about creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Meaning, if you, as a progressive or an American Muslim, decide the nation is stained by original sin, and you withdraw from politics, you stop voting, you stop organizing.
You are literally clearing the field for the people who don't share your values to take over.
You create a political vacuum, they fill it, and then your cynical belief that America is irredeemable becomes true, because you let it happen.
It's a cycle of failure. His core belief here is that if you believe in democracy, you have to believe the system can be changed through participation. Otherwise, you've already given up on the whole project.
But the interviewer brings a huge challenge to this idea of gentle internal progress.
A very strong one.
Citing the civil rights movement, the point is made that those victories were bought with blood and jails. They were wrested from a system that did not want to give them.
This is the argument for dialectical struggle, for leverage. The source points to the dynamic between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X,
arguing that it was figures like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers who scared the establishment into compromising with the more moderate MLK.
Right. The militant wing creates the leverage for the moderate wing. They act as this dialectical counterforce. The system deals with King because the alternative is much more threatening.
Which, if that's true, means that change requires confrontation and external pressure, not just polite appeals to the country's better nature.
The author, though, pushes back on that interpretation. He focuses on the narrative that the reformers used. He points out that MLK constantly leveraged American values and the Constitution.
He saw his movement as the fulfillment of the founding documents, not their rejection. He was trying to make America live up to its own promises.
And this is where he brings in that analogy to Islam again.
Right.
He says, just like Islam planted the seeds of liberation for slaves in a 7th century context that couldn't handle full abolition, the U.S. founders embedded provisions, like the amendment process, that could later be used to abolish slavery and expand rights.
So progress happens when later generations find and cultivate those seeds of idealism that were already there. It's an argument for working within the system's own moral framework.
And that focus on working within the framework leads to this critical point about appearance and discourse, about how you talk to people.
If you want to change the system, you have to speak a language the majority can understand and accept.
He strongly advocates for what he calls the Zohar and Mandani model, which means what? It means this careful balance of idealism and pragmatism, presenting yourself impeccably, like MLK did.
The suit, the non-profane language, occupying the moral high ground.
Because that image makes the message appealing to the broader American public. And he contrasts that with the highly negative woke talk that was really popular from, say, 2016 to 2022.
That discourse that focused heavily on America's evil founding and its irredeemable nature
Was, he argues, politically ineffective. It just alienated most Americans who see themselves as patriots and triggered a huge backlash that hurt the progressive cause.
So the takeaway is that the language of redemption, I love this country, and that's why I'm criticizing it to make it better, is just more effective than the language of condemnation.
And all of this theory, all this history, it just slams into the present moment. It all culminates in the ultimate stress test, the Gaza catalyst.
Yeah, the current conflict in Gaza is the moment where arguing for American power just feels almost impossible.
And the author makes this profound, tragic admission. He says, flat out, there is no genocide without the U.S. The U.S. is the only country that could stop it.
Wow. So to admit that level of complicity and still write a case for American power, how do you even do that?
That's the internal struggle he talks about. He says he wrestled with the book's title and its core argument after October 7th, but he stood by it.
Why?
Because, in a way, the tragedy proves his point. It proves that U.S. power is, for better or for worse, the only decisive factor on the world stage. If U.S. power is the problem, then changing U.S. power has to be the solution.
But the host in the original source makes a crucial point here, that disastrous Gaza policy was not inevitable.
This is a vital point for anyone on Path 2. It wasn't structurally determined.
It came down to the choices of individuals. A different president, say, a Bernie Sanders, would have had a completely different policy.
Right. Joe Biden's policy was rooted in his own very specific ideological fixation, this kind of outdated 1960s view of Israel.
So that emphasizes individual agency. If one person's bad ideology can cause this much harm, then a future person's better ideology could do immense good.
And he argues that structurally, change is coming anyway. The pro-Israel lobby's power isn't permanent because the Democratic base is shifting so dramatically.
He predicts that by 2028 or 2032, a Democratic candidate will have to be critical of Israel just to win the nomination.
Which proves the system, however slowly, is responding to citizen pressure.
So if you accept that democratic change is possible, what are the actual policy alternatives? What can be done?
Well, he explores two main paths for damage control and leverage.
The first is the BD isolation model.
Yeah.
Like the movement against apartheid in South Africa.
Right. Divestment, boycotts, sanctions. It's about trying to isolate Israel by pressuring the U.S. government to withdraw its support. It's the path of withholding American power.
And the second option?
This is the one he prefers, the superpower leverage model. Instead of withdrawing power, you use it coercively.
You leverage the military aid, the financial aid, not just to Israel, but to dictatorships like Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
And you demand things in return. You stop acting like a junior partner. You use the billions in aid as leverage to force adherence to basic human rights. It's about using the power that critics want to see taken away, but using it for good.
It's a very proactive vision. But then you have to deal with the other side of the coin, the destructive consequences of U.S. restraint.
The problem of absence.
Exactly. The source points to Syria after 2013. Obama drew the red line on chemical weapons, didn't enforce it, and the perception of American withdrawal led to a chaotic power vacuum and over 500,000 deaths.
There are also cases of justified intervention where no one else could have stepped in. Kosovo, to stop ethnic cleansing. The first Gulf War, to reverse an invasion.
And the comparison to Libya in 2011 is key here.
It is. The intervention there prevented a likely massacre in Benghazi. And while Libya is a mess now, its death toll is multiple smaller than Syria's. The conclusion is that American power is often the first and last line of defense in times of mass killing.
So its absence can be just as deadly as its presence. That is the central dilemma.
And the final answer seems to just be a kind of measured realism. You can't ever get pure principle, but maybe you can fight to get the percentage up from 20% to 40% to 60%. The whole fight is inside the halls of power, trying to get the humanitarian-minded advisors to win the argument.
Which brings us to the final call to action. Fighting harder for the American project. Who is he actually trying to reach with this message?
He clarifies that the main audience is probably non-Muslims just because of demographics. But you can feel that the message is aimed squarely at his own community, at disillusioned American Muslims and young progressives.
And he acknowledges the personal cost of this, which I think adds a lot of weight. He talks about being called a traitor by people in his own community, which has to be incredibly difficult when you've spent your career criticizing U.S. policy.
The whole struggle is to inspire those people to stay in the fight, to move past what he calls a tendency toward self-hatred about their American identity.
Because that self-hatred leads to retreat, and retreat means defeat.
And he says there are signs that engagement is working. He points out that despite being massively outspent by groups like AIPAC,
the message about American hypocrisy is actually breaking through.
It's tangible. Nearly half the Democrats in Congress are now calling to condition aid to Israel. And the message is even reaching strange places like the May J movement, with figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene speaking out against the violence.
Which shows that a coalition can be built around that shared value.
And the ultimate vision here is not to get rid of American power, but to capture it, to make it an instrument for Muslim values, for the values of justice and human rights that American Muslims believe in.
But that takes time.
A lot of time. He says this is a 10, 15, 20-year fight. Victory isn't going to be instant. But he points to the remarkable rise of Muslim political power, the fact that we can even talk about Muslim mayors in major Western cities.
And that's the final powerful contrast. In a hypothetical authoritarian caliphate, he says, you would never see a Christian mayor of Cairo. The American framework, for all its blood and flaws, allows for that kind of political dynamism.
So the final call to action puts the burden right back on the citizen. He says, if we don't get the America we want, we have no one to blame but ourselves. It's a powerful statement of individual agency.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, the listener? This deep dive has walked us through some really agonizing territory. We've seen how the U.S. is defined by these incredible universal ideals on one hand,
And by deep historical sins and horrific current flaws on the other, with Gaza being the most painful present-day example of that failure.
and the essential choice for you, the learner, is still there. Do you disengage? Do you believe the original sin make the whole project a lost cause?
Or do you engage? Do you believe that your actions, your participation, can actually steer this flawed but decisive power towards some kind of redemption?
It's a huge, demanding choice. The argument is asking you to accept the bleak reality that American power is the only game in town, and the only path to justice is to get inside the machine and fight over the controls.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to chew on. It builds on his analogy of the ideal state being an asymptote.
That's a line that a curve gets closer and closer to, but never actually touches.
Exactly. So if all power, American power, a hypothetical alternative, whatever, will always be flawed and self-interested, always approaching perfection but never reaching it, then what is the most effective way to struggle?
Is it the long generational fight to change the values of the powerful? To try and raise that percentage of principle over interest inside the U.S. system?
Or is the most realistic path to justice in our lifetime just to minimize the scope of that power, to ensure that any flawed actor, including our own government, has less global reach to do damage in the first place? Which path do you choose?
It's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.